The two groups of genes that get affected in terms of how they talk to the rest of the body when you've got toxic stress are your metabolism and your immune system.
We have a lot of false ideas about stress. And the main one is that it's always a negative state to be in. As soon as people decide to embrace their stress and harness the energy, it actually changes what's happening in your immune system and your cardiovascular system and in your brain.
I'm exercising less and I'm eating more, but I'm actually losing weight.
Can you talk about how excess stress and stress-related hormones like cortisol can lead to more weight gain and even block our ability to lose weight?
It's such a critical point. I feel like this was my story when I was in my 30s. So I had a couple of kids. I was trying to lose the baby weight and nothing seemed to be working. Like all the things I used to try in my 20s just wouldn't pass muster anymore. And what I realized was that I was a total stress case. I had what I would call now high perceived stress. So even if you looked at my life and you looked at, okay, I was a practicing physician and I was working long hours and I had 2 kids at home and all those things, but there were a few pieces that I think are really relevant for our listeners. One is that I have a history of trauma. And I think that changes your stress response system. Not just I think it, I know it. And I think that's really critical. Like we know this from the research that's been done by Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai, where she looked at the offspring of Holocaust survivors and also people who were in the 9/11 terrorist bombings. And she's shown how soul wounds can be passed on. So it may not even be you. It could be that it's your parents or your grandparents or someone else in your lineage who's passed on this tendency toward metabolic dysfunction. And we can talk more about the research if you want to, but the two groups of genes that get affected in terms of how they talk to the rest of the body when you've got toxic stress are your metabolism and your immune system. Really critical. But more, this garden variety stressor experience that people have, I think of it in 2 different categories. I think of, kind of the capital T trauma, the things that all of us would agree are really traumatic, like surviving 9/11 or being in a car crash. And then there's these small T traumas that some of us, myself included, can get somewhat bent out of shape over. And that could be, a breakup with a partner. It could be an email that you received that upsets you. There's so many different things that fit into that small T trauma. And then the question is, what's the downstream consequence of that? And it's got a lot of downstream consequences. I mean, it affects the microbiome. It can give you increased intestinal permeability, leaky gut. It can stimulate the cortisol receptors in your abdomen. So abdominal fat has 4 times the cortisol receptors as fat elsewhere. So if you're like me and you're in your 30s and you're so stressed out and you've got so much cortisol kind of floating through your blood vessels, it really stimulates that belly fat. And then it can block the production a lot of the sex hormones that help you with metabolism. Things like testosterone and progesterone, which in women is really important for sleep and for soothing, but it's important in men too. Then there's the effect on insulin, which you and I have talked about before. And a lot of people don't appreciate that, it's not just what you're eating that affects your dance with insulin and then downstream what's happening with your glucose levels, which is probably the best way to really assess your metabolic health. But stress has a huge impact. Whenever I wear a continuous glucose monitor, I could eat like an ideal hormonal specimen. But if I'm stressed, my glucose is going to be 10, 20, 30 points higher than it should be. And so really understanding the role of cortisol, I think, is critical.
Now, this is another thing we don't think about in regards to our blood sugar. Even, when we think of that, we generally put that in a pithy box of like food is going to influence that. But your thoughts and your perceived stress as well. So I just yesterday was looking at this really interesting paper And this particular paper, this was just published in 2019, and it was titled Adverse Childhood Experiences in the Onset of Chronic Disease in Young Adulthood.
Yes.
And finding that these traumatic experiences that also can get passed down, by the way, transgenerationally, and there's another paper on that as well. Basically, there's alterations in our genes, but also non-genomic aspects of how our cells are functioning. Basically, our sex cells in particular are getting altered, passing that information down to our kids,
Yes.
possibly making them more adaptable or more suited to live in a hostile environment, right? So more propensity towards being reclusive, more propensity towards being aggressive, more propensity towards holding on to more belly fat and fat in general, because you might need to hide, right? These are all evolutionary adaptations that in a way help us to survive, but not necessarily to thrive.
Cortisol, I think of as the highest priority in terms of hormones in the body. So there's hormones that you might think of, things like estrogen, testosterone, DHEA, progesterone. Those are not necessarily needed to live. So you can get away without them. So a lot of women who go through menopause, men who go through andropause, and have low testosterone, you can still function. You may not function as well, but you can still function. They're not necessary for life. Cortisol is necessary for life because it controls your blood sugar, as we talked about. It also modulates your immune system. And it's one of those hormones, it's the chief hormone of your stress response. And so it's designed to help you if you encounter a threat, like a tiger, to run or to fight or to, in the case more so for women, because women have a different stress response, freeze or fawn. So cortisol is the main actor behind the stress response. And what I see in my practice is that probably 97 to 98% of people have a problem with their cortisol, and they don't know it. So it could be high cortisol, which was my story in my 30s. That was kind of the central problem that I had with belly fat and weight loss resistance. So when I measured my blood level of cortisol, it was about 3 times what it should have been. And I remember talking to a psychiatrist friend at the time, and I was like, Luann Brizendine. I was like, why is my cortisol so high? And she said, girl, every female physician I know has a cortisol that's 2 to 3 times what it should be. It's just the nature of being in a stressful system. And then there are people who have low cortisol. They've gone through a phase of overproducing cortisol in response to their environment. And now they're in a state where they don't make enough. And so there's this gap that they feel. Like they wake up in the morning and instead of jumping out of bed, like I imagine you do, and start dancing with Anne, they put their feet on the floor and they're like, oh, I don't feel restored. I need Shawn's book, Sleep Smarter. So and even for, some folks, they have high and low cortisol within the same day. So it's not just your level of cortisol, which is supposed to peak within 30 minutes of when you wake up and then gradually decline. It's also, what does the shape look like? What's the cortisol awakening response? What's your cortisol when you first wake up, 30 minutes later, 60 minutes later? What's your diurnal cortisol? Because cortisol is kind of like a flower, like a lasagna that opens in the morning and then slowly closes. And a lot of people lose those patterns, which lead to more immune dysfunction, more of those chronic diseases that you mentioned associated with the ACE study. And I'm so glad you brought up the ACE study because you reach so many millions of people. And a lot of folks don't realize that some of those challenges that you and I had in our childhood, even if we're quite resilient now as adults, they then map to 40 different chronic diseases as you get older, whether that's mental health, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, or physical health, like immune dysfunction, autoimmune disease, cardiovascular disease, all the, most of the main killers in the US.
Yeah. And it's so obvious once we realize that our thoughts create chemistry,
Yes.
And obviously, again, you talked about this really interesting connection between cortisol and possible weight gain, but you also mentioned the thyroid earlier. And the thyroid and cortisol have an intimate connection. You know, they're
Yes.
all along that HPA axis. And so the thing that you said that is, I don't want people to miss, is that our thyroid and associated hormones can essentially downregulate or upregulate our metabolism. So we might be cutting calories, but your body's perceived stress or threats can downregulate your metabolism, can slow things down. And then this is where people start to get into that self-defeating or learned helplessness, because
Yes.
there's like, I'm cutting the calories, I'm doing the exercise, but my weight isn't budging.
Critical point. So there's all this interdependence between these hormonal systems. And I feel like you just described it perfectly. So what we know with thyroid, for instance, is that if you're a stress case like I was in my 30s until I became a yoga teacher and, started to meditate every day, which is really essential for those of us who have ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, before age 3. Got to have a daily mind-body practice, essential, non-negotiable. So when you've got high perceived stress, it can block thyroid function, as you described. So there's so many things that can do it. It's not just high stress, but cortisol is a big part of the story with how you up or down regulate your thyroid function. There's the role of nutrients, copper, zinc, selenium, iodine. There's the role of vitamin D, which is so essential for thyroid function. And then there's this piece that I think is so important, that the body has a few different brakes in the system. And by this, I mean, like a handbrake you have in the car. And one of the brakes is that if you're under a lot of stress, the handbrake that goes on with your thyroid is called reverse T3. So you start to make more reverse T3, which blocks thyroid receptors if you're under a lot of stress. And what I see with a lot of folks, because I measure reverse T3 along with a full thyroid panel and I measure cortisol, is that a lot of folks will go through a stressful situation, even potentially like low carb, reducing their carbs, to a significant degree. That is perceived as by the body as stressful. And so that can potentially raise reverse T3. It's designed to be this emergency brake that you use, like if you're in an intensive care unit. But what I see is that a lot of people have those small T traumas, those little slights that aggregate and lead to this toxic stress response that can lead to weight loss resistance, can lead to the thyroid not working the way it should, can lead to dysregulation of the cortisol. You said one other thing that I want to highlight that I think is really important. And you know how I like to nerd out with you. So this is a nerd moment. I'll just call it out. So I think of the control system for your hormones as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So you've got your brain kind of talking to your adrenal glands. That's where you make your sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, etc. But there's a bigger control system that we're still learning about. And that includes the thyroid, it includes the gut, and it includes the gonads. So testes in men, ovaries in women. And so the way I think of it is not just the HPA, I think of it as the HPA-TGG. So hypothalamic pituitary, adrenal, thyroid, gonadal, gut axis. It's quite a mouthful, but that's kind of the bigger control system that we want to be thinking about.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. The next thing I was going to reference is that even when we're testing a hormone, for example, we cannot look at that thing in isolation.
Yes.
None of our hormones are operating in a vacuum. And all of these powerful metabolic stations in our bodies are deeply connected and interacting. And so we tend to identify like, my adrenals are whatever, dysfunctional, but it's just like your adrenals are part of a much bigger system. And the conventional thinking is like, we got to try to hammer away and address that broken piece, where in reality, this could be something upstream or downstream that's actually causing the issue. The most important thing is proactively having a stress management / processing practice. You said it's non-negotiable. When you said that, I was like, let's bookmark that moment. Non-negotiable practice for yourself.
Especially for those of us with early trauma. So, I sometimes use myself as an example, not because I think I'm so great, but because
You are.
Well,
Sorry.
that's debatable. But I had parents who divorced when I was really young. I was a year old. And I've never had a relationship with my father. And so that counts as an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. So my ACE score is about 6, which is pretty high.
Yep.
I've had some psychiatrists who count it as 7. It's, debatable. But the point that I want to make is that when you have these early childhood experiences and they occur so early, you get this kind of trigger response with stress. You go into these automatic responses that often do not serve you really well. They might serve you, if you've got that tiger chasing you, but they don't serve you when you're trying to stay married. They don't serve you when you're trying to parent. They don't serve you when you're trying to lead an organization. And so the more that we can really slow down that process and maybe even heal the way that those adverse childhood experiences affected us, the better. So I'm not saying that's the magic bullet for weight loss. What I'm saying is we all deserve to know about some of the ways that we can clean up the residue of adverse childhood experiences and adult adverse experiences too. And so those daily mind-body practices, for sure, I meditate for 30 minutes every morning, no matter what. But also, there's things like psychedelic assisted therapy that has been shown to make a gigantic difference, durable, in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I feel like a lot of my patients, even if they don't meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, they have partial PTSD, or they have what's known as subthreshold PTSD. And what I think is so promising is that many of these sacred medications that went underground in the 70s and 80s, now we know from large randomized trials, they can really help us with the way that these toxic stressors and trauma get lodged in our system. So we've talked a bit about how it affects cortisol. And you made this point that I think is critical, which is it's bigger than just cortisol, of course. My next book is about the PINE network, the psychoimmunoneuroendocrine network, and how trauma affects it. So we all know about the mental health effects of trauma. We're quite conversant. There's lots of books about that. But I think a lot of people don't connect the dots to physical health, to the weight loss resistance, to the autoimmune disease, to the dysregulation with their hormones, as we've talked about. So I think it's important that we look more broadly, especially with physical health. I think you're also saying, and tell me if this is right, that we have to personalize it.
That part, yeah.
I think that's such a part of this conversation because, what works for me in terms of working in a positive way with my adverse childhood experiences may not work for you. Not everyone wants to sit and meditate for 30 minutes. That just doesn't work. They'd rather dance or they'd rather have sex and orgasm. There's so many different ways that you can work with your stress response. And I think it starts with an awareness of how toxic stress might be lodged in your system. So this awareness of your own adverse childhood experience, and I hope maybe we can have folks Google the ACE questionnaire so that they can assess that, or we can link to it. So knowing your own ACE is so important. And then to understand that it's not just, your ACE score is bad, good luck with that. It's that we've got all of these ways that we can work with it. And then to personalize it so that you can, not let that trauma continue to live on in your body and continue to maybe harm your relationships and affect your connection to meaning and purpose and the way you work out at the gym, the way you take care of yourself.
So stress can have positive and negative effects, and often it has both at the same time. It's not the case that stress is always toxic, and every time you're in a stressed out state, it's like your body betraying you and you're destroying brain cells. I mean, we have a lot of false ideas about stress. And the main one is that it's always a negative state to be in, and it only has negative consequences for your health and your happiness. So the stress mindset effect is all of this research, it shows that people can be protected from a lot of what we think of as the inevitable consequences of chronic stress or severe stress if they hold certain beliefs about what it means to be stressed and their capacity to deal with that stress. So there are a few key beliefs that seem to make people really good at stress. One of the first beliefs that can make people better at stress is the idea that stress is energy you can harness. And that when you feel these symptoms of stress, maybe your heart is pounding or you're breathing faster, or you feel butterflies in your stomach, or even muscle tension, that it's a sign that your body is getting ready to rise to the challenge. And it's actually true. But what's interesting is as soon as people decide to embrace their stress and harness the energy, it actually changes what's happening in your immune system and your cardiovascular system and in your brain. That makes the stress response both healthier and more skillful so that you actually are more likely to perform well under pressure. You're more likely to be able to connect with others. So the idea kind of allows that natural capacity to emerge. So that's one idea. Another idea is to understand that you don't have to do stress by yourself. So many of us feel like stress is a do-it-yourself project. Everything in life is a do-it-yourself project. I alone can deal with this. I don't want to be a burden on others. Nobody understands what this is like. All those different ways we can feel alone in our stress. And people who have a bigger than self mindset and understand that stress is often a signal that you need to reach out, that you're feeling stressed because you need help or because you're not the only one. And sometimes your body and your brain will make you feel lonely or anxious or overwhelmed in order to nudge you to connect with other people who are going through the same thing or who have resources to support you. And so people have that mindset. Again, they tend to be much more effective at dealing with the big stress. And also they tend to have a stress response that's healthier, that's good for the heart and good for the immune system. And the third key idea is the belief that even if you're going through a stress you would never have chosen for yourself, that it is possible that it can bring out something good in you. So maybe there's nothing good about the situation, like the situation sucks. And also, we know that situations that are traumatic and stressful can bring out our strengths, can help us reprioritize, understand our values, strengthen relationships, point us in a new direction, that capacity to learn and grow from stress is part of it's in our DNA. Yeah. And people who believe that, again, are more likely to access it. So when you have those mindsets, that stress is energy you can use, that you don't have to do it all by yourself, and that it's possible to learn and grow from any situation. I wanted to give people another way to think about movement, that, if you're motivated by weight loss, and it's working for you, it's like that's probably already happening. I don't think people need more information or encouragement about that. Yeah. I feel like so many people don't understand the effect that exercise has on mental health and on belonging and on resilience, and that it's so profound. I mean, you said it's what our genes expect from us, that when we move on a regular basis, when we are active, we are able to access the parts of our human nature that help us thrive and that literally produce joy and allow us to experience joy and meaning. So I decided to leave the whole conversation about weight aside, and say, like, it doesn't matter what your size is or what your health goals are or what your physical goals are. You don't even need to have physical goals. You don't need to have weight loss goals to want to embrace movement as something that is going to truly enhance every aspect of your life. If people understood this, I feel like people would be people don't exercise all day. So there are very few things that can do the first thing, which I'll mention, which is that it sensitizes your brain to pleasure. There's nothing you can do that actually changes the structure and function of your reward system the way that exercise seems to do it. And that it teaches your brain to expect things to be pleasurable, and it enhances your brain's capacity to enjoy everything from good food and a beautiful sunset to interactions with your kids or with your friends to anything that we find pleasurable. It actually, it amps up your reward system. It makes it more robust and responsive. Like endorphins work better, endocannabinoids work better. And like I said, I've literally never seen anything in the research that has that effect on the brain other than deep brain stimulation, where you literally have to surgically implant an electrode into your reward system and wear a pacemaker for your brain. And that, it's one of the cutting edge treatments for depression. And it may also help people recover from addiction, because addiction can really mess with your reward system. But like, other than implanting an electrode in your brain and literally giving your reward system an electric shock continuously to try to wake it up, exercise seems to be the only thing that does this. And think about like what that means for your well-being. If everything that feels good feels better.
Yeah.
And it does the opposite too, right? So it makes your brain more resilient to stress. It's exercise is such a powerful antidepressant. So it works on both levels. And I feel like people have a better understanding of that side of it. At least they've heard, that exercise can be an antidepressant, or that it can enhance antidepressant medication and therapy. But I feel like this idea that exercise actually makes you better at enjoying things is the thing that people really haven't heard yet. So one of the things I don't write about in the book, but it sticks with me. Mm-hmm. There's something that I call the joy gap, which is that people dramatically underestimate how good it will feel to move their bodies. If you ask people, how will you feel when you work out? People tend to predict, I'll be tired, it'll be exhausting, it'll be boring, it'll be unpleasant. And when they actually do it, even people who say that they don't like to exercise, what people typically report is, I feel better, I feel more optimistic, I feel like I can take on the world, I have more energy, not less energy. And so, this is a gap we have where we think exercise is going to be so hard and so uncomfortable and so awful that, we might think we'd rather have an implant in our brains, that would be easier. But the actual experience people have is so much the opposite. So I'm interested in all psychology, all neuroscience. And this is I think the most interesting finding of the last decade in all of science. And this is the insight that your muscles are basically an endocrine organ that secrete hormones into your bloodstream that affect every system of your body. And from a health point of view, your muscles will secrete hormones and other proteins that are good, that fight cancer cells and that are good for your heart health. The things that we know, typical why exercise is good for your health. But your muscles, they secrete chemicals and proteins when you exercise that are also really good for your brain health. And one of the first papers, almost 10 years ago, that was published explaining that when you contract your muscles, they literally secrete these proteins into your bloodstream that make you resilient to stress and can protect you from depression. The scientists called them hope molecules. This idea that literally your muscles are manufacturing like antidepressant molecules. And the only way to get them into your bloodstream where they can then travel to your brain is you have to contract your muscles. Like that's it. But your muscles it's like a pharmacy in your muscles. And anything you do that contracts them, walking, hiking, running, dancing, weightlifting, like swimming, anything, you are going to be dumping hope molecules into your bloodstream that when they get to your brain, they work as an antidepressant. And they also help people recover from trauma. Like that's like a miracle. I mean, because of course it's wonderful when medications work for you, but for so many people, medications don't work or they don't do the full job in terms of helping with mental health. And the idea that your muscles could provide you with the equivalent of something like an antidepressant medication, like that is just, I think it's phenomenal.
So some of the symptoms that people might have are trouble waking up in the morning. So they just can't get out of bed and they might be sluggish. That's one pattern. Another person might just jump out of bed startled, right? And another person, they will have irritability and mood swings throughout the day. Sometimes that 3 p.m. crash where you either like want to take a nap or you like want to yell at somebody, that can be a sign of adrenal dysfunction. Then things like pain all over in their body, libido issues, fatigue, irritability, anxiety, trouble sleeping, which I know you and I are both passionate about getting our adequate sleep. This can be very much connected to adrenal dysfunction. People tend to say they feel tired throughout the day, and then they end up being moody throughout the day. They end up being tired but wired at bedtime, where it's time to tune in for the night. They start getting that second wind of energy and they can't fall asleep. Other manifestations might be things like excess weight gain, and people just can't regulate their healthy weight levels. And some people, and most of these people don't complain as much or maybe aren't seen as much, but I think this is very relevant, as some people just can't put on the weight. So they might be like, I'm exercising, but I can't put on muscle. muscle wasting, just feeling like you're wasting away, you're not thriving, I would be a way to describe the adrenal dysfunction and just being in a state of overwhelm at all times.
Wow. So this speaks to a lot of people's experience, which is, they're really trying hard to lose weight and they're counting their calories. They're in even a caloric deficit,
Yeah.
right? Because that's kind of the superficial scientific thing. When I was in my nutritional science classes in college, it's just like, expend more calories than you take in. It's simple. Then you'll lose weight.
Basic math, right?
Basic math. Your body's a calculator, right?
Yeah.
But in reality, your thyroid is deeply, and this association, this connection with the adrenals, deeply influential over your, quote, metabolic rate and how your body is processing and expending that energy. And so you can be in a place where you're cutting it. And I've seen this. I've seen people come into my office and they're eating 900 calories a day and the scale's not budging and they're just suffering. They're broken and they're just like, I don't know what's wrong with me, right? And of course, you've seen this many times, but helping people to understand what's going on internally and helping to heal and support these glands is a big part of this mission.
And it's challenging because I'll see some women that are like overly exercising and they're restricting their calories, and that sends a message to the body. And that message is, hey, girlfriend, we're in a stressful time, but don't you worry, I'm going to hold on to your calories so you're not going to starve. I see that food isn't available right now, and I see you're doing all this running. You must be running from some like intruders, right? Because our genes haven't really adapted to dieting and the stress of our day-to-day lives. They're more, and our stress response is more adapted to, hey, we're being chased by a tiger right now. What are we going to do? Or, hey, we're in a famine. Can we conserve some of our calories so we don't have to look for food right now? And so it's really adaptive physiology at its finest. Our body's always trying to help us out, trying to help us survive. And if we're sending these messages to the body like, hey, food is not available, or we're under a lot of stress, the body's going to try to help us out. It's going to help to be like, you don't have to look for food, honey. We're going to hold on to all of your calories for you, right? And so that's what happens, unfortunately, is the metabolic rates slow down. And I will have some women where I will say, hey, how about you really focus on sending yourself safety signals and eating nourishing foods and not exercising so much, maybe switching up the type of exercise that you're doing. And they're like, I'm exercising less and I'm eating more, but I'm actually losing weight because the body knows that it's safe and it's getting the signals that food is plentiful, that we're not being chased by a bear. And so it's okay to like thrive and focus on metabolism.
And so what brings about adrenal dysfunction? Like what is the thing that causes that to manifest?
It's stress, right? So when I ask people that I work with, what was going on in your life before you get sick? There's always some sort of a stressor. And I would say majority of people, it's something like they were going through a divorce. Maybe they had, unfortunately, a death in the family. Perhaps they went through a bankruptcy or some other kind of accident. Something, either terrible happened or something like going to graduate school, moving to a new city, starting a business, or having a baby, even joyful things that really change our life in a big way. These can be stressors that become that essentially get our bodies stuck in that survival mode. And normally our stress response is supposed to be acute. So we see that saber-toothed tiger or the bear or the lion, whatever it is, right? We see it and our body puts out cortisol, and cortisol prioritizes survival. So when we have lots of cortisol on board, what our bodies starts to do is it starts to break itself down the longer we need cortisol to fuel that cortisol response, right? And it's really, really helpful when you're trying to run away from something, right? And eventually, hopefully you got away from the tiger and now you can get some rest and perhaps sleep it off, eat some food, whatever, shake it off. There's various methods of dealing with acute stressors. And then after that, if the stressor is gone, then we come back to our healthy adrenal function, healthy amounts of stress hormones where we have a little bit more in the morning to get us out of bed. And then it's like a smooth ride down slide until we're ready to ease into our nighttime routine and sleep really, really well. Now, the thing that sets it off is chronic stress. So this could be, we don't have tigers chasing us. Most of us don't these days, but this could be
maybe Tiger King.
Tiger King. Oh my gosh. That could be anything from our inflammation within the body because of the foods we eat or the chronic infections or hidden sources of inflammation like toxins we may be exposed to. This could be not eating blood sugar balanced. So eating too many high carb foods, not enough protein, not enough fat. This can put us, stress out our adrenals. It could be psychological stress. So if you're currently dealing with, and I always say, cutting out toxic people works sometimes even better than cutting out toxic foods, right? But if you have a source of toxicity in your life right now, that could be incredibly stressful. I had one reader that read one of my books and then wrote a review and I said, I didn't have to do anything she said. I just quit my job, which was highly toxic. And then I feel better and I'm in remission now. And I'm like, yay, if you could identify that current stressor, get rid of it or do something about it, then you can make yourself much healthier. There's past stressors too, like traumatic stress that it happened, 20, 30, 40, 60 years ago, but still stay with us. And that can really, really mess with our ability to handle stress and with our overall adrenal stress response. And then there's one that sends people into adrenal dysfunction, like the fastest way to get in is sleep deprivation. So if you're not sleeping enough, if you're having perhaps too much coffee or whatever is interfering with your sleep, that's actually one of the fastest ways to get in. What happens initially when we're under a lot of stress, our adrenals are going to produce a lot of cortisol, right? And cortisol is what I like to think of it is like our go hormone. It's like drinking 8 cups of coffee. And it's like putting a bunch of rock stars in a hotel room and just letting them go on forever. Or, just like one toddler in this room for 10 minutes,
just
right?
One toddler versus just 8 rock stars.
Exactly. So it can make a mess very quickly. And if you don't check your cortisol levels, you're going to lead to a lot of breakdown of your body, right? It's something that instead of building our body up, it's going to break our body down and puts us in a bit of a catabolic state. And so our body recognizes this and our body's always trying to adapt and always trying to help us survive. And so where we're under prolonged stress, the body starts to say, do we really need to produce that much cortisol at all times? Let's try to shut down some of this cortisol production because it's affecting other systems, right? And so the early stages of adrenal dysfunction, and some people, for this might be 10 minutes, for other people, this might be 10 years, where they're more in a high alert state and they're more like angry and irritable and they're like just ready to go. Everybody around them is like super slow, not smart enough, and they're just go, right? And then as time goes on, this might turn to like that 3 p.m. crash or trouble sleeping in the evenings, but their cortisol production is going to be a little bit suppressed, where if you were to do a test, they might have normal levels of cortisol, but they're just on a bit of a roller coaster throughout the day. So they might not have healthy levels of cortisol in the morning. It might be too low. And then later in the day, it might swing up too high and they'll get a bit anxious. And then perhaps it'll drop and then they'll have, again, a rise in cortisol in the evenings. And I call this like a roller coaster. You can kind of picture what it looks like, right? Yeah. And then as time goes on, all of those peaks start to drop down. And this is what I see in people with autoimmunity, with Hashimoto's, like 80% of them, they just have flatlined adrenals. So they're just having trouble waking up in the morning. They can barely get by and they go to bed and then they like sleep and they don't feel refreshed in the morning. And these are the people where things like intermittent fasting isn't going to work for them. It's going to make them feel worse. Doing things like cold plunges is going to make them feel worse. They just don't have enough stress response to build a healthy stress response. So everything is overwhelming to them, right? So you ask them to, I don't know, let's say if you had a child or a partner with it, you'd be like, can you take out the trash? No, I can't do it. That's just too much for me. And it's just, day-to-day life becomes too much because they just don't have enough of that cortisol, which is enough of it helps us be vibrant and present and helps us survive. So we talked about all these stressors that we're bombarded with on a daily basis, whether that's like watching the news or whether that's, yeah, we don't recommend that.
Just that in and of itself.
Whether caring for others or work stressors or past traumas or just ongoing inflammation, exposure to things in our life, and thinking about what messages that sends to our body and to our ancient genes, right? And it's saying, okay, we need to conserve energy. We don't have enough energy. There's just too much. Let's slow down metabolism. Now, for a while, I thought about, when I was trained in functional medicine, what do you do when somebody has adrenal dysfunction? You can put them on replacement hormones, right? So they're not making enough cortisol. Let's give them cortisol, right? But that doesn't necessarily solve the issue if they're still under a lot of stress, right? And you can suppress their own production of internally produced hormones that way. You can kind of suppress the feedback loop that way. And so it's not a long-term solution. And the solution is really to rebalance that stress response. And so what if, rather than having all these messages to the body that say you're not safe, what if we found a way to tell our body that it's safe in a language that our body could understand, right? And this is what I call safety signals. And these are targeted interventions. I have 14 different ones in the book that focus on making your body feel safe so it could get into that parasympathetic, that rest and digest and heal state. And we can get into more of a anabolic state versus that catabolic, let's break everything down because we're stressed out. Let's clean house, right? Let's focus on rebuilding and healing. And I have a lot of different ones that we do, and it's amazing because it works really, really well in just 2 to 3 weeks versus using some of the hormones or some of the extreme lifestyle changes that I used to recommend. It would take 3 months to 2 years to get better. But a safety signal. So one danger signal might be if you are starving, right? So if you're not getting enough calories, if you're nutrient deficient, if you're eating foods that are inflammatory to you, your caveman genes are going to think, oh my goodness, we're just eating grass all day. That we're humans. We don't eat grass. There must not be enough food available, right? And we're so depleted. We need to conserve energy, right? We need to slow down our metabolism. And so what we do is we actually focus on nourishing the body, and we utilize anti-inflammatory, nutrient-dense foods that focus on getting plenty of macronutrients. So we're doing protein and fat. We're eating blood sugar balanced. And we're also getting a lot of micronutrients. So that lets the body know that we have lots of food. We do not have to conserve energy, right? We can ramp up our metabolism because we have everything that we need. And it's I don't know, maybe it sounds woo-woo, but it actually works. And it works in just like 2 to 3 weeks where people are like, wow, I'm healing. Another thing is getting rest. So getting enough rest is going to be helpful. Your body can heal. You could go into those, it could heal your body with deep sleep, and you can heal your body with your brain with REM sleep. When you get enough of that, then you're going to start healing really, really effectively.
Now, would this be in contrast to exercising your face off? If you're trying to lose weight and you're dedicating 2 hours a day to working out and you're sleeping for 6, what would you do? Would you shift one of those hours to sleep rather than having those 2 dedicated to exercise?
I would shift that time to sleep more, and then I would also consider the type of exercise that you're doing. So if you're in a catabolic state, you want to consider what types of exercises are going to be anabolic and build up your metabolism and build up your body versus what exercises are going to be catabolic. So if you're doing like a lot of like biking and aerobic exercise, running, that's actually going to help to break down your body further. And so you need to build up your body more. So doing things like weight training can be beneficial. Doing things like yoga for relaxation. Those are usually the types of exercises that I recommend for people that are in that catabolic state and that have low metabolism, because building more muscle is going to help us become, is going to help speed up our metabolism, right? Along with with getting more protein on board. And it sounds counterintuitive, but it actually works, right?
Yeah.
Because people are like, but I was told like the math is this and this, but it's like, but there's all these other factors and parentheses and powers that you need to consider. It's more, it's more like trigonometry than really straightforward math.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here to up-level your health today.
Men and menopausal women probably have the easiest transition to fasting because their hormones, there's not as much fluctuation. If you're already lean and you're still at peak fertility years, so 35 and under, you have to be careful about when you're fasting.